How you doing? Hope you're doing well. Um, if you haven't read the notes about untangling sects, I suggest you go back and read them now because we're going to refer to them a little bit here. Um, so the question is, what about sex matters? From the last time, we saw that there is some effect of sex, at least when it comes to sex discrimination cases, right? So, and it also seems that sex causes pro-plaintiff behavior. And what that means is there's something about being a female judge on the circuit courts of appeals that leads them to vote in a pro female fashion when it comes to sex discrimination. And not only that, the presence of a female on a panel leads the male judges to also vote in a more pro plaintiff or pro female manner in those types of cases. What we cannot discern from that analysis is what exactly about sex matters. Is it just the fact that a female judge sees a female that's been discriminated against, or is there something about sticking together, or maybe understanding where they're coming from? We couldn't answer that question. So what we're going to dive into today is whether we can answer that question, and if so, what might be one of the causes of sex's effect on sex discrimination voting. Okay, what that article concluded, or the one we talked about last time, or in the notes, it concluded that there's this informational account. Females have unique experiences that they share with one another, but that males cannot share by the nature of not being female. And for the panel effects, at least, the idea is that females can bring these unique experiences to bear and share them with the male counterparts. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about whether or not that actually accounts for a female judge's behavior. So suffice to say, it's been a tough go for females in government, at least historically speaking. They've fared much better recently, but Florence Allen, who was the first female judge in the federal judiciary in 1934, she couldn't even eat with the other judges. They ate in a men-only dining club she wasn't allowed in. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in law school or leaving law school, she was denied a clerkship with a Supreme Court justice simply because she was a female. And this is despite having very high letters of recommendation and all of that. Later on, a different professor pretty much threatened a district court judge to try to get her a job because so many of the male judges and justices were so hesitant to have a female clerk. Later on, when she became a law professor at Rutgers University, she made less than her male counterparts, and they said the reason for that was she had a husband, so she didn't need as much money because it was a second income. So even prominent female judges have experienced various forms of sex discrimination in their employment. Just because they've reached the highest levels of the profession doesn't mean that that discrimination never existed. Okay. From the mid 40s to about the mid 60s, it's below 10%, maybe 5%. There's this huge explosion in the 1970s, and it shoots up to around 50%, somewhere in the 2000 range, and it stayed about there since then. Okay. In the 1970s, President Carter wanted to appoint a lot of females to the bench. That was an important part of his presidency. He tried to keep those promises. These females who were appointed to the bench were interviewed, and 81% described sex discrimination as one of their primary challenges in their employment. So the question here is, what effect is this going to have? And the authors of the paper that I'm going to describe here make this argument that that huge explosion in females in excuse me, law school changed things, right? Perhaps discrimination lessened a little bit when they became a more prominent part of law school and the legal profession. So there's a lot of evidence out there in psychology and sociology and all of that that show that men and women think about where women fit into the world a lot differently, right? The difference can be one of two, it can come from one of two things, right? It can come from experience or it can come from perception, all right? There are some evidence that the differences are perceptual. For instance, 10% more women perceived sex discrimination in the late 80s than in the mid 70s, but there was no change from men. So maybe the amount of sex discrimination didn't increase, but the perception of what counts as sex discrimination did. Men are more conservative than women regarding women in the workplace. This is true 20 years apart in the 70s and the 90s. It's still true today, not as much, but it's still true today. And basically, this is not a status issue. Females who happen to be lawyers or doctors, they see more discrimination than their male counterparts in those professions. So it's not like, oh, well, men typically have the higher status jobs, so it's really just a question of status. No, the women who have those high status jobs all experience discrimination just like women in lower status jobs. Experimental work in psychology shows that women are more likely to see evidence of harassment. And the reason for that is they're simply more sensitive to sexual misconduct than are men, right? So they're perceiving it in a different way. So a man could witness another man do something in the workplace and think it's fine, and a woman could say, no, that's sexual harassment, right? However, there's also experiential evidence. Women are just more likely to experience sex discrimination than men are, at least historically speaking, right? This may be related to what's called the empirical realities of women's lives. All right, so throughout most of history, women have been more likely to experience discrimination based on their sex. Okay. But you know, women in the judiciary are the top of their field. There are very few federal judges, but there are lots and lots of attorneys. So the people who are nominated and confirmed to the federal judiciary are the best of the best. It could be the case that somehow those people just avoided sex discrimination. However, there is not really that much evidence for this. Like I said, especially when it comes to the Carter years and interviews and surveys later on conducted with female judges, it shows that they have different attitudes than men on these issues. Some authors write, women judges, perhaps as a consequence of personal experiences, evidence greater attitudinal feminism than men. And they attribute this to, they have different experiences relating to sex differences. Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said, most law school classes had just 2 women, and you felt that every eye was on you. Every time you went to answer a question, you were answering for your entire sex. You were different and the object of curiosity. Now, for the most part, if there were, let's say, 150 men in the classroom and only 2 women, it's not going to be true for the men that they're answering for all men. Okay. Other judges recalled their male professors calling on female students when discussing rape cases, and we know that some were told they were taking a good man's place in the law school, and they really didn't belong. How sex relates to sex discrimination how sex relates to voting behavior in sex discrimination cases may just be a function of having had these experiences. It may be a function of empathy. People who empathize with an experience may just be more prone to behave in a certain way. Okay, so in these Title VII discrimination cases, the plaintiff has to show that what's called but for her sex, she wouldn't have been subject to any adverse employment action, right? So basically, the burden is on the individual to show that they didn't receive the promotion, they didn't receive the job exclusively because of their sex. That's kind of hard to do, but the idea here is that women who have experienced sex discrimination might be more persuaded by various arguments about but for her sex. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor one time said something about being able to put oneself in the target's shoes, and that will affect the extent to which one believes the target's story about the complex facts at issue. Right? Judges are always trying to do this. They're always trying to put themselves in one's shoes. Maybe it's just easier when they've had a similar experience. So maybe it's easier for women, for female justices who are more likely to have experienced sex discrimination than their male counterparts, to bring these experiences to bear, to put themselves in the sex discrimination plaintiff's shoes. All right, so what exactly is empathy? Well, there's a couple of different types, but generally speaking, empathy is the ability of one person to take on the perspective of another person. So the observer taking on the perspective of an actor. There are two types, trait empathy and situational empathy. Trait empathy really comes down to just the similarity between the two people, the observer and the actor. So shared race, shared gender, something like that, shared sex. Situational empathy, though, is when one places him or herself in the other person's shoes. Okay? They're kind of dependent on one another, though. Situational empathy depends on one's ability to observe a trait similarity. So, the trait alone shouldn't influence female judges, right? There's many, many female litigants, so the idea that they just vote in favor of other women or other females, that doesn't quite describe what we're talking about here. Instead, female judges are unique because they share a trait with the sex discrimination litigants, and they potentially have situational empathy. Maybe they've experienced that sex discrimination in their own lives. So it really comes down to both of them, the shared trait and the shared situation. So, do these negative experiences matter? It's been said that a judge is the sum of her experiences, and if she has suffered disadvantages or discrimination as a woman, she is apt to be sensitive to its subtle expressions, right? At least the argument goes more so than male judges who have not experienced this or are less likely to have experienced it. So the theory that the authors of the reading for today are putting forth is that there's a link between the ability to empathize situationally and voting for that plaintiff, okay? And again, the situational empathy depends on the trait, so the combination of female litigant and having experienced sex discrimination probably combine to matter. The issue here, though, well, not the issue, but the conditionality effect here is that different female judges vary in their ability to empathize. Remember that graph I showed you about the enrollment in law school shooting up in the 1970s and kind of evening out at 50% in modern times. And that suggests that not all female judges have experienced the discrimination that other ones did. I described Florence Allen and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They were very early on in terms of women's place in the legal profession. They were the trailblazers. They were the pioneers. It's likely that they experienced more sex discrimination than did somebody who went to law school in, say, the 1990s, when they made up 45, 50% of the class. In addition, attitudes toward women have just liberalized over time. There are fewer people who support traditional gender roles and all that type of thing. So it's the combination of women being in the profession and sort of what is expected of women socially. Those things have changed. So it's possible that younger female judges are less empathetic towards the sex discrimination plaintiffs. Okay. So to put this in terms of a hypothesis, trailblazer female judges, which these authors say are those who went to school, law school before the 1970s, experienced more discrimination. Because of that, they'll have more situational empathy in sex discrimination cases, and therefore they will be more likely than men who went to law school at the same time as them to support plaintiffs in sex discrimination, right? So we're comparing, for example, men who went to law school in the 50s to women who went to law school in the 50s, and men who went to law school in the 80s to women who went to law school in the 80s. Okay. The socialization matters. So the female judges who went after the liberalization, after the 1970s, they're going to be the same as their male counterparts. That's the hypothesis here. It's important to realize that, excuse me, we're not actually measuring situational empathy here. That's really hard. The authors are using the year that the judge went to law school as a proxy, what we call a proxy for situational empathy. That is, it's a stand-in that probably correlates with the thing we're interested in here, situational empathy, but it is not itself situational empathy, okay? So, these authors looked at all sex discrimination cases in the courts of appeals from 1995 to 2008. The dependent variable is a 1 if pro-plaintiff, that is pro-female, and a 0 if pro-employer. And the independent variables are the sex of the judge, the year they graduated law school, and an interaction between the two. Remember, interaction terms are literally just multiplying two columns of data together. So we're multiplying sex times law school graduation year, and then we can see the effect of graduation year for men versus graduation year for females. So comparing females to males. Plenty of control variables, ideology, Democratic appointee, the lower court decision, right? All these things matter. They might change the outcome. Liberal judges and Democratic appointees are more likely to vote for the plaintiff, for the woman. So if you look at this very blurry picture, apologies for the blurriness, we see what's called the marginal effect of sex, right? And what that means, it's the effect of sex on pro-plaintiff votes by the year the law degree was earned. And remember these confidence intervals things, right? So here, when the confidence intervals, the lower bound of the confidence intervals crosses 0, this, if you follow my cursor, this solid line at 0, it means there's no effect. However, there is a point here from around 1955 to just before 1975, where there is a positive effect. So the effect of sex on pro-plaintiff votes in sex discrimination cases is positive for women who graduated in these years. In other words, or sort of in more layman's terms, women who graduated law school from around 1955 to around 1975 are more likely to issue a pro-plaintiff vote than their male counterparts who graduated in the same year. Okay, that effect it's not present for women who graduated before 1955, and it's not present for women who graduated after 1975. Speculating on the reason why there's no effect for before 1955, it's probably just because there's fewer women, and that's why these confidence intervals are very large, so it's hard to make comparisons between, say, 2 women and 1,000 men. It's easier to make it between, 200 women and 800 men. And then after 1975, that's consistent with the author's expectations that the post-liberalization of law school didn't experience as much sex discrimination, so they can't bring that situational empathy to bear. So let me just sort of summarize these results again. It's not very strong for the first female graduates, so the effect of sex on voting for women in sex discrimination cases doesn't really exist for the first judges, but it is statistically significant for about a 20-year period when women were still facing discrimination in law school. There's about a 0.12 a drop in pro-plaintiff votes for women. That drop is very small for men. And then, excuse me, after 1975, there's no difference between men and women. Excuse me. So this is consistent with the theory that when law schools liberalized and more women were in those cohorts, those women can't connect as much with sex discrimination. They haven't faced it. It's not to say they haven't faced it. They're just maybe less likely to have faced it than their older counterparts. Okay. So when Sonia Sotomayor was being confirmed, she took a lot of criticism for saying that she hoped being a wise Latina woman, that because of that she would come to different judicial decisions than white men. And people said, well, wait a minute, aren't they supposed to follow the law? There's a right answer. They should come to that, blah, blah, blah. All the things that we know don't actually affect the judges. But if you look here, you might see that Sotomayor might just be unable to separate herself from her experiences because she might have situational empathy with perhaps women, perhaps Latinas, or whatever other person in whose shoes she could place herself. So we see here that women who faced more sex discrimination in law school are just more willing to vote for sex discrimination claims relative to men once they're on the bench. And they're also more likely than women who went to law school later to do the same, right? The idea here is that they're better able to place themselves in the shoes of the women claiming discrimination, okay? So here we see that there is this effect potentially of empathy, and this sort of moves beyond a lot of the things that we've talked about so far in this class about the constraining capacity of the law, various psychological elements, strategic behavior, and all of that. It turns out that the life experiences just matter. You can't get rid of them once you're a judge. Judges are not robots. I go back to that old staple that we talk about during the attitudinal model and the strategic model. They're just not robots. They have experiences, and your experiences matter when you're making decisions. And we see here that they also matter for judges when they're making decisions. So this isn't the last we'll see empathy. In a couple of lessons, we'll talk a little bit more about empathy and how it comes to bear more than we might expect and in a broader set of contexts than just sex discrimination. So I look forward to talking to you then.